Hello and welcome back to Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
And today we're going to talk about neighbors. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I have a great setup where I'm very proud that we've developed some relationships with neighbors. But I know that by and large, that's not the case with most Americans when we've got an era of pull into the garage, close the door behind you, and you just don't have any interaction with anyone. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can be curious in developing relationships, specifically with our neighbors.
And neighbors are really interesting. I'll never forget when I was a kid, I would go back to the farm in Iowa from time to time. My dad was Navy, so we were always in big cities, Navy ports. And then sometimes when he would go on cruise, we'd go back and live in Iowa, which was a big change for me. It was a bigger change for the poor people in Thompson, Iowa, who thought I was from Mars, right, with long hair and puka shells and things like this, when they all had butch cuts and never been 5 miles from their own farm. But I'll never forget one time when my grandmother took me over to my Uncle Stanley's. Now, Uncle Stanley was in a wheelchair. He had had a fall from a large grain silo, and therefore couldn't do a lot of the work of the farm anymore. And the farm still worked, and I never understood that. We would go over and visit, and one day I asked my grandma, I said, how does that happen? She says, well, when he needs something done, one of the neighbors comes by and does it. And I thought, what? Yeah, if it's tractor maintenance, he's got this neighbor that does that. If it's something here, and he's got folks that help him all around. And so the farm worked the entire time, and the neighbors rallied. And this is back in volunteer fire departments. My grandfather in Renwick, Iowa, on the other side of the family, was the mayor, the head of the bank, I don't know if he was the police chief. Anyway, and it was just, everybody pitched in and everybody did stuff together. And I think about, what would that be like today? What would we expect to have happen if one of our neighbors fell and was in a wheelchair? Would we expect to pitch in? I think the answer is no. And why is that? And what are we doing? You and I have talked about, how do you scale when you're working on problems like poverty or violence or domestic violence or things like that. And I really believe that it's got to come back to one-on-one with who's in your circle, and to reach out, not just sit back and wait, but to reach out and pull people into your circle. And I think this applies with this too. How do we reach out? How do we reach out and pull neighbors into our circle? Because I think, wouldn't it be great if we were in a time when something happened and we could be there for each other?
Absolutely. So we've been in our present house for about 10 years, and shortly after we moved in, I don't know if I heard a podcast or heard something that really got me thinking about being intentional with getting to know neighbors. And one of the action steps that we took is to host the National Night Out. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a actual organization, and it's affiliated with the local police department and fire department, and you can register online, and you welcome neighbors over to your home, and you can have local politicians or emergency personnel come over and introduce themselves, and just so that they're familiar with you and the folks on the block, etc. But we had a pool in those days, and the home immediately next to us was a group home, is still a group home for developmentally disabled women. And when we extended the invitation for this National Night Out, we said, we're going to do hot dogs and hamburgers and swimming. Well, they came over and had the time of their lives. They were so excited. But the thing that surprised me was the elderly folks on our block, who I had not seen out of their homes because they're not outside necessarily doing yard work. They came over and were so appreciative and so thankful that we had included them. And then, they come with the casserole dishes and all the side fixings, and it was lovely. It was a lovely, lovely evening. And I'll take an extra, 2 minutes to share a story of our neighbor Rose. She has since passed away, but she was in her early 90s and had been single for maybe a couple decades. She had been widowed. She'd been widowed for many decades. Had started collecting tattoos in her 80s, just this spitfire of a woman. So the officer that was sent over as the representative for our neighborhood to introduce himself was this young guy, I don't know, maybe mid-20s, and Rose was smitten with him. And he's sitting at the end of the table and she's just flirting with him like nobody's business. It was so funny. And then, at some point she says something like, "Man, I wouldn't mind getting arrested by you." And everyone just turns and we're kind of horrified, and this poor 25-year-old young officer, he's just beat red, and it was just hilarious. But it caused there to be this rapport with Rose and with others, and we started to ask questions. How long have you all lived here? And many of them, they had designed the home and been there since it was built. And we're realized that even in this sentence I've mentioned that Rose has since passed. That generation of folks in their 80s and 90s are coming up to the end of their lives. And so being intentional about getting to know them, especially those that maybe have really suffered through the pandemic, they've been homebound, they've been isolated even more than usual. The intentionality behind doing that, I think, is tremendous.
I do too. And I was at the city for a while, and I can tell you that as a director, I was director of economic development for the city of Albuquerque under a previous administration, and the mayor made sure that all of us, especially in leadership, fanned out. And you're right, the police officers and the firemen and everybody did that. That was a great opportunity to meet the community. But each of us, I went to several of those each time, just to say hi and how are you doing and things like that. And they were wonderful. And we did one here at our current house here. And you're right. Sometimes people come out and see each other, and they've lived next to each other for decades and never met each other. And I would encourage people that you don't have to wait for a night out.
Sure.
Please do find out when they are. I think they're in summer, August or July is my recollection.
Or early fall.
Early fall, maybe it's early fall when kids go back to school. But I would encourage, one time I remember going around and just putting a door knocker on everybody, well, knocking on the door, but if they weren't home, just leaving a door knocker and say, we're going to have a backyard barbecue. And we picked everybody in our immediate neighborhood. This neighborhood's been around for 30 years. And it was just a great, great time. And everybody said, thank you for doing this. Eventually there was a little Crime Stoppers group that got together, and we ordered the sign, and we did all this stuff. And but when the gentleman across the street passed, we all went to the funeral and supported the wife and brought over meals, and we became our own little group here. That's the kind of stuff that I think is super important and builds community. We get less into I think warring factions if we develop community, and especially in our neighborhood. And in our neighborhood, there's probably some people which are probably not in our current groups, and people of which we might not associate otherwise. And then you can hear different points of view. When we go out and meet at the mailbox now, we have one of those group mailboxes in our neighborhood. We discuss the topics of the day, and that's a great way. And we clearly would not be of the same mindset, but it's great to hear and hear how people are doing.
So it really starts with kind of asking the question, what would it look like to have a relationship with our neighbors? And, that's got to be a conversation with you and the other members of your household. And also, what level of comfortable am I with including people in my home or in my backyard or in my front yard? And you have to work through those first, right? Those are the beginning questions that you have to ask. But then as you kind of establish where you want to land, then you can begin to be curious about the people on your block, the people in your immediate vicinity. And I was encouraging somebody very recently who had been staying with us for a while and ended up moving about 30 minutes away. And she was saying, I don't have any friends, I don't know anybody. And I said, well, utilize technology. I said, utilize something like the Nextdoor app or some of those other platforms where, there's that geolocation and it lets you know other people in your area. Maybe it starts with who's having a garage sale this weekend, and maybe you be purposeful to walk over there and it's like, hey, I live 3 doors down. That's a non-confrontational opportunity. Not that it would be confrontational, but it's a very casual, I guess I should say, opportunity to meet somebody. They're already out in their driveway,
Right.
and you can stop by and say hello. Or if there's a group that they go out walking dogs together, or there's a book club or a knitting club or a fill in the blank, or hey, I need to borrow a lawnmower. Whatever the asks are in some of those social platforms that are for your little community group. Can you meet a need?
Mm-hmm.
Can you volunteer your time, your service, your stuff, and begin to meet people and just come out of your own shell as you begin to be curious about the people around you?
And as you find the different personalities, we have a lovely couple up the street. She's a UNM professor, and actually now we all went to her retirement party and all that. She's retired now, but her husband plays in a band.
Mm.
And so when he goes over to one of the local microbreweries or wherever, everybody in the neighborhood goes,
That's
right?
fun.
And so, and we've got our own little email chain and text chain, and we all know each other's phone numbers in case there's an issue. When we go out of town, we tell each other so that everybody can keep a look in the house. And, I live in a kind of neighborhood as Mrs. Kravitz from Bewitched, where everybody kind of knows what's going on. But, I know I'm not worried about my house when I leave because people know, and we do talk whenever we see each other. I think that's a really big deal. We have one guy whose one son lived in another house just nearby, right across the street from us. So father, son in the same neighborhood, they went to go sell their house and sold it to his daughter. So now I have one set of kids from the neighbor.
That's cool.
Now there's a different set of kids from the neighbor, right?
That's fun.
And then when they needed a reference for a job at Sandia, a security clearance, I knew enough to talk about it. I think it's funny because when you go for a clearance, for instance, they want to have one of your neighbors weigh in. Nowadays, who knows their neighbors?
Right.
How does that work, right? And so
Right.
anyway, I think there's a lot of benefits to that, from security, from just getting to know each other when things happen, when you need a cup of sugar or an egg for the recipe, and just general, being part of a community. I think that's the biggest part.
I had a conversation with somebody who I love dearly and respect dearly about wanting to put a sign in the yard that was counter to a sign in their neighbor's yard. And so he was running the idea by me, and I said, let me stop and ask you something. I said, what's the purpose of that sign? I said, you putting a sign counter, whether we're talking a political sign, opposite candidates, or you're talking about some specific messaging. So what is that going to accomplish? Is that going to posture you as the neighbor who is approachable, as the neighbor who cares, or is that going to posture you as somebody who is instantly against them? And, he said, okay, I see your point. And so that is one of those areas where, I don't know, we have chosen never to put a political sign in our yard because we don't want any additional wedges to come between us and somebody, where we might be in a different group then, because when we're in our family and then extend it out into our neighborhood, they're all individual communities, right? And so I want it's not that I don't want to be real or genuine or, have my own thoughts or opinions, but I don't want to promote something that's going to instantly cause a division because of that judgment somebody's going to have towards us as they drive by and see whatever sign we have in the yard.
Today at lunch, I was talking about that very thing, and I don't want to go down the path of political correctness and arguing about politics, which these yard signs can often get into. But I often think about how I'm representing myself in a given situation, so that I don't start out losing half the crowd, and it's about influence. How can I have a positive influence in a situation if I come in and stir something up before I even open my mouth, right? And so I think that's something that is lost, and it's part of the civility. Number one, we're not civil enough to, if somebody disagrees with us and it's on their T-shirt, to talk to them anyway. And number two, why do we want to go in and have that stance established before we even start talking to people? And I think that this is the issue. As we get into our own little groups and don't sway from them, are we reaching out to people who are in the other groups? I think that's the key. And the more we do that, the better our overall community is. But how we represent ourselves is a big deal. What are we wearing on our T-shirt? What are we putting on our bumper sticker? What are we putting in our yard? Is that something that is, going to stop the conversation before it can start?
Absolutely. As is true of the title of this whole podcast series, and as every episode we try to really ask those questions, how do we be curious and not cause a judgmental attitude or not be in judgment? The neighborhood in which you reside already has a specific flavor, right? We are broadcasting from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we've got very distinctive pockets of population, unfortunately. And so depending on what community you're listening from, you may have already these identified pockets of folks who populate any particular neighborhood. And so if you have new additions to the neighborhood and they don't seem to match the projected image, how intentional are you about making them feel welcomed and included, and just breaking down any stereotype or divide that may have been caused by populations 40, 50, 60 years ago? Because, let's be honest, a lot of these communities were founded decades ago and they were populated by certain demographics. And so times are changing, populations are shifting within neighborhoods, and we have to be intentional about reaching out to folks and saying, you are welcome here. This is your home, and we're glad to have you. We're glad to have your input. We're glad to have you as part of our safety team or our neighborhood watch or whatever it is that you have established, and to go out of your way to be curious about how do they contribute to your little clan.
No, and I think you bring up a good point about it. Somebody new in the neighborhood, when you used to go take a plate of cookies or brownies to your new neighbor, that doesn't have to be a lost art.
Right.
That's something it's appreciated, and it's always good to do. And another thing that my wife and I do, we take a walk in the park that's near here, as every night we can, and we decided a long time ago that we were going to say hello to every single person we saw. Whether they had their face in their phone, whether they had earphones on, whether they were looking down at the ground or looking up, it didn't matter. We were going to say hello. And sometimes we don't get a hello back.
Sure.
But most times we do. And sometimes it's kind of a shock, like, do I know you? Right. Why are you saying hello to me? But I think the more we do it, and now people know.
Right.
And so it's funny because we have our little claim to each other that this person now says hello to us, and I wonder who else they're saying hello to because we did hello. Right. That kind of thing is infectious. Everything you do is an influence.
Yeah.
Do you want to be an influence towards saying hello to people, or do you want to be the influence of the person who's got their head down and doesn't want to talk to anybody?
Absolutely. Going back to the older population within your neighborhood for a moment, I just cannot stress enough about how important it is to develop some of those relationships for safety's sake. And, beyond just the saying hello, which is a great icebreaker and begins to cause some familiarity, but to begin to be aware of maybe some habits and patterns. So when something goes wrong, that and it's more than being a nosy neighbor. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm not saying be the one to poke your this much of your face out of the curtain and spy on everybody, but just to be aware, to have a very conscientious awareness. Our across the street neighbors, it was a husband and wife that moved in, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years after we did. I don't know how the relationship began. I honestly don't, but for whatever reason, we began to have a rapport. And then when my daughters were in a real serious car accident, they came over with a bouquet of flowers each. And I remember that so endeared me to them and just was so appreciative of that. And then I was very intentional. If I baked an enchilada and had another mini pan or something I could take over, great, or Christmas cookie time, whatever the case may be. And so we had this exchange back and forth. And about, 8 months ago, 10 months ago, I saw ambulances pull up in front of the house, and my heart sank. And the gentleman of the couple had some heart problems in the past, and he'd actually lost consciousness. I thought, oh no, please don't let it be, that something very serious has happened. And it ended up being his wife. And she passed very quickly. And, but I just knew we needed to go over there. It was, I don't know, 10:30 at night. And I walked across the street and he just held me and just wept. And it was right for me to be there. My husband came over and he just needed comfort in the moment. And since then, we've been very intentional about inviting him over for dinners. And, I asked him to come over when it was my birthday. And, just an excuse to welcome him in and to be family when he doesn't have family around. And just, I can't tell you how impactful that has been on both sides of the street, right? For him and for us.
When I lost my wife a few years ago, because we had been intentional and knew the neighbors, everybody knew, and everybody came over and they brought food and done other thing. One fun thing that happened afterwards is my neighbor started pulling my trash cans in. Well, and so as soon as I realized it was him, I started pulling his in. If I got there first, then the neighbor across the street started playing. And so now we have this thing on trash day as to who can get to the trash cans
That's
first.
Funny.
And that's gone on, right? And that's the kind of relationships. And she now, every time she bakes banana bread or whatever, makes an extra and brings it over, right?
Nice.
And so, those are the kind of things that are just precious, and that's what makes life, right? That's what brings joy. That's what is the little things that make the life meaningful, and you're not just going through the motions.
There's a sweet advertisement that I've seen playing on TV recently about neighbors and how the one woman observes another woman feeding the birds. And at the end of the commercial, the one woman has shipped a birdhouse to the neighbor. And as they're on their respective balconies, they look out and the one that was the recipient of the birdhouse kind of knows it was the neighbor and kind of does the head nod acknowledgement and mouths thank you across the way. It starts with observation, right? It starts with, whether it be something good or bad, to be observant and then to ask those, again, gentle, safe questions, not to be interjecting into somebody's life where you're not welcome or not needed, but ways to start to form relationship and to bring back that culture of civility into your neighborhood.
There's that old quote about most people are living lives of quiet desperation or whatever. And we think we might be intruding and we don't want to get in other people's business, but most people welcome that. They really do. And what you said about observation is key. It's key to everything. Even in your group of immediate friends, we should be more thinking, instead of thinking about what we want to say or how we want to rebut or what our agenda is observing, what are the needs of the people around us. I have a couple of friends who are like that, and I just want to be around them all the time because they're clearly in the place of trying to figure out who needs what. And they're often the one who just all of a sudden will get up and go get something and bring it back, and the person says, wow, thank you. And it does start with observation. It starts with observation in your family. It starts in observation with your close friends, but it can extend to your neighbors. And that's one of those ways that we can pull things in. And, the whole, as you said, the podcast is called Curiosity, Not Judgment, but that curiosity in the form of observation and paying attention to what's going on is often the first step.
Absolutely. So here's what I would ask for those of you listening. If you've got an extra few minutes and want to maybe contribute some thoughts about how you have been intentional in your neighborhood, whether it's a plate of brownies, maybe you participate in National Night Out or something in that vein, would love to hear those stories. Let's begin to kind of just get this pool of stories together about how you have done that intentional neighboring, that you've been curious, not in judgment, in your neighborhood. So the best way to get in touch with us is through the website, curiositynotjudgment.com. There is a contact us link right in there, and you can type in your comments, or if you want to even send some photos, maybe you've got a great shot of you and your crew at the last night out or something like that. We'd love to participate and see what you guys have going on. So thank you for just your time and attention. Thank you, Gary, as always, for just contributing your wisdom in how we just operate in curiosity in the midst of our life, whether that's in our home, in our neighborhood, in our business, you name it. We got to stay curious.
Stay curious.